All right, let's pray I remember all of this stuff. There's a lot of names in this journey that we are about to go on. Forgive me if I pause and dig through the files to try and make this all make sense. Eugenics translates from Greek to well-born or good inheritance, depending on who's doing the translating. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's the idea that people with bad genes who mate with others with bad genes will create offspring with bad genes who will have lower intelligence and will be called what they called in the beginning, feeble-minded. So the idea of eugenics is that we need good people with good genes who are smart, who will mate with each other and create offspring with good genes so that society does not go down the toilet by a bunch of dummies. Obviously, they believed that it was heritable and that it was a firm number that was passed on from generation to generation, and that it was divided, of course, by race and nationality. The idea goes back as far as Plato in ancient Greece, who advised for selective breeding. But the term that we have today of eugenics comes from a man named Sir Francis Galton. And he is a British man, and he is a brilliant man. I think it's very important to note that these people are brilliant because we have to acknowledge that the most dangerous ideas have come from highly functioning, intelligent, rational minds, if you will. So Galton is the father of modern statistics. His phrase that he says all the time is, if you can, count, which is cute. He creates the first weather map. He also is the first to note that no two fingerprints between humans, it's very unlikely that two fingerprints from different humans would be the same, and gives us the modern fingerprinting technique that we use to this day. He's the half-cousin of Charles Darwin, and when his cousin releases On Origin of Species, he's obsessed with it. He actually coins the term nature versus nurture. And he takes Darwin's conclusions, obviously, to unscientific extremes. He explicitly says that the Negro is at least 2 grades behind whites when it comes to intelligence. And he takes the phrase survival of the fittest and applies it to breeding, and saying that breeding correctly, good genes, is survival of the fittest. Side note, survival of the fittest is not a phrase that Darwin came up with. That was a man named Herbert Spencer, who was probably a eugenicist before eugenicist was in vogue. Nonetheless, Darwin did not distance himself too much from his contemporaries who drew these conclusions because he just liked the attention. He wasn't drawing conclusions about race or humanity when he was putting forth his theory of natural selection. But he did not correct many people, and later on would sort of embrace the idea and write specifically in human terms about this. Anyway, Sir Francis Galton in 1902 meets a man named Charles Davenport, who is an American. His father is an abolitionist. That doesn't matter. He still loves eugenics. And he comes back from London and is very, very eager to get back into the study of eugenics and prove the nature of breeding. And what he does is he secures funding from the Carnegies and establishes a research center in Cold Springs Harbor, New York in 1904. And in this research center, he takes defective animals, a cat without a tail, and mates them with a cat with a tail and different chickens and things of that nature, and tries to track how the offspring turn out. And thanks to something called the Mendelian ratio, is able to track and predict what will happen with these offspring. So this leads him to believe that this will work with humans as well, which is obviously not so clear-cut. And since we can't study humans over hundreds and hundreds of years, they just assume that it works. Well, thanks to xenophobia, racism, and ableism, eugenics becomes entirely too popular. In 1907, many states start adopting measures to sterilize those who are deemed inferior. This goes on, and eventually there's 29 states in our union who adopt these measures until the 40s when they start to unravel them. Well, the eugenicists need some scientific measurements to prove that black people and immigrants are inferior based on intelligence. They need something scientific. They've got this Mendelian ratio and whatnot, but now they're on to intelligence. So how do they establish that the white people are inferior naturally because of their blood and their genes and are the only ones who should be procreating? Enter, stage left, a man named Lewis Terman. He's a psychologist at Harvard, I believe it's Harvard, and he creates an American version of the IQ test. Where does he get this IQ test? He gets it from two Frenchmen named Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. And the irony of the French test that he adopts is that it was written for children, commissioned basically by the French government to find French children who have special needs, who are slower learners, so that they can adapt to them in the classroom and that they not be left behind, not for them to be removed from society. And Binet warned and said, if this test is used for anything other than children or for this purpose, it would be very dangerous and it should not be used for that. But that did not stop Louis Terman because he was a eugenicist, so he adopted the test from the French version and made it applicable to adults and children to basically discourage the feeble-minded from seeking higher stations in life. The test is used on the Army first in World War I. It's used on 1.7 million soldiers. And they use it to identify who's going to be the best soldier and who should receive officer training. The test is also brought to Ellis Island for immigrants because everyone was afraid of immigrants at the point by a man named Robert Yerkes. And immigrants are tested as well. It did not matter that English was their second language. Who cares? This is the test, and this is what it is. Robert Yerkes has a protege, and this is the name that you must remember. It's Carl Brigham. His protege, Carl Brigham, he asked to compile the data and take his 890-page report and make it make sense. This report basically broke down the IQ test scores by race. And of course, at the top, the white people were just soaring. They are just, I don't know how you made these geniuses in the lab. And the Jews were here, and Russians and Poles, and the Negroes are just, obviously, just not cutting it. So he compiles these statistics, and this gives them more ammunition for the idea that certain people are inferior and certain are superior. Well, then the test makes its way into civilian life. And moves around in civilian circles and becomes a barrier for people. And this doesn't bother Terman at all because he wanted to prove that black people as well as others are inferior. And in the 1920s, a lot of scientists actually said, wait a second, this IQ test does not make sense. I don't understand how this would measure intelligence, or even if you can measure intelligence. If anything, it probably measures cultural standing or environment or something of that nature. And more importantly, it's very dangerous because it could obstruct opportunities for people based on this junk science. And it falls out of favor for a little bit, but not enough to dim the impact of the IQ test. And now we must bring back into the picture Carl Brigham. Carl Brigham had done his dissertation at Princeton on the Binet test that was adapted by Louis Terman. And he worked on the Army IQ test, the Alpha test, and compiled the racial data. But the greatest gift that Carl Brigham would give the United States would actually be the bane of existence for most teenagers between the ages 17 and 19 for at least 2 years before entering college. The Scholastic Aptitude Test was created by Carl Brigham, an avid eugenicist. The test was based on the IQ test. It was aimed to predict the intelligence and the capabilities of a student to perform well in college. The test was so close to the IQ test that Brigham had actually published a scale to convert the scores from one test to the other, between SAT and IQ or IQ to SAT. Brigham believed that if the race mixing continued at an accelerated rate, it would destroy society. And so they used these tests, of course, to rationalize that the government should take action. there were obviously a lot of issues with these tests, the IQ and SAT. One was that blacks in the North did better than blacks in the South. But they always found creative ways of rationalizing these things. And one of the rationalizations for this was that the blacks who had sought for better opportunities in the North were obviously of higher intelligence. Either that or they simply had more white blood. Well, the SATs become one of the main barriers of entry for college. The interstage right man named James Bryan Conant. He was the president of Harvard. He was a chemist. He was also one of the leads on the Manhattan Project. He would advise Truman, the president, during World War II to drop the bomb on Japan. He was another brilliant man. He wanted to find a test that he could use for scholarship applications to diversify the students who came into Harvard. But he's not talking about the kind of diversity we imagine today. It's not based on color, it's based on class. He thought that there was probably some broke white boy in Montana who could really do some good at Harvard and tear up the institution and make the upper class, keep them on their toes. However, his assistant dean, his name is Henry Chauncey, brings him the SAT, created by Carl Brigham. And it really technically doesn't do what it's supposed to do, but he loves it. And he decides to convince other members and heads of administrations and colleges that they should adopt this test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, for their scholarships. And one thing leads to another and another and another. And by the end of World War II, basically, the test that Carl Brigham created that came out of the IQ test directly linked to eugenics becomes the barrier of entry for any school related to the College Board of Admissions. This test, once again, based completely on faulty science that aimed to prove the superiority of whites and the inferiority of blacks, that did not accurately measure intelligence, became the standard for access to college. Fast forward to today, and you still have a large gap between races, black and white, or whites and otherwise, when it comes to IQ and SAT tests. But the SAT test administered and owners will tell you that it has nothing to do with the test, despite the risks, despite after all this time, it's not with the test, possibly with the environment. We do everything we can to make it fair. Now, we live in New York City, and I don't know if you know this, but New York City is actually one of the most segregated school systems in the country. And test prep, the test prep industry is booming, but only booming in white and Asian neighborhoods and among white and Asian parents. Now, the board that administers the SAT in 2014 had to admit that test prep is not insignificant when it comes to your test scores, that there is obviously a difference for those who receive test prep. But what's the problem? There are obviously certain kinds of people receiving and having access to test prep and certain people who do not, and it divides among racial lines. The question being, once again, the SAT, it came directly from eugenics, out of the IQ test. If one can take test prep to make the immutable thing called intelligence, to increase their score and their aptitude for college in which they should be prepared for, if that actually raises your ability on the SAT, then what does the SAT actually measure? Does it measure anything other than what it originally aimed to measure, which was the inferiority of anyone who wasn't white and the superiority of those who were white? 90 years ago, in 1930, Carl Brigham, the creator of the SAT, wrote an article where he eviscerated all the study and all the conclusions that he had come to when it came to IQ and SAT. He said that they were groundless, absurd, and without foundation, and that none of these test results are related to intelligence whatsoever. We had a complete change of heart. Nonetheless, the train moved on. 90 years later, children are still being held to the standard of the scholastic aptitude test. The challenge here for you, the prompt, if you will, is can you name anything in this country, in these United States, in this society, that is measured on an institutional scale that is not measured in relation to a white person, or specifically whiteness? The tests that are in school, the charts of skin disease that doctors use, can you find anything at large that is not put against the average, and the average being whiteness, white mind, or white skin? And that's it.